Order.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr. Speaker, I want to begin this afternoon with two quotations that are relevant to the context of this year's budget. The first is from the OECD yesterday, and it says, in respect of New Zealand, the government needs to adhere to its fiscal consolidation plans, given the twin vulnerabilities of rapidly rising public debt and high external debt. Delaying monetary tightening is appropriate in light of the fiscal contraction and risks to global growth, though as reconstruction accelerates, capacity pressures will bear close watching. As the government shrinks, reinvigorated structural policies are needed to channel resources into productive economic uses. That was the OECD yesterday. Mr. Speaker, the second quote is a little longer in its history. It's from President Kennedy in 1961, but it's still relevant to the context of this budget, when he said, "We sometimes chafe at the burden of our obligations, the complexity of our decisions, the agony of our choices. But there is no comfort or security for us in evasion, no solution in abdication, no relief in irresponsibility. For it is the fate of this generation to live with the struggle we did not start in a world we did not make." Mr. Speaker, in terms of New Zealand's place in the world and the international conditions that have very much shaped the context of this budget, it was a struggle we did not start, and it was certainly a world that we did not make. But there's one other important point in the OECD report that goes to the heart of some of the issues in this year's budget. It noted that apart from falling commodity prices and the ongoing impact of the Christchurch earthquakes, one of the impediments to growth in New Zealand at present has been household deleveraging. And when you look at the budget tables, sir, and you look at the experience over the last couple of years, you can see, or one can see, that since the Budget 2010 tax initiatives, there has been a significant increase in household saving rates, probably far greater than was ever envisaged at the time, and that is likely to continue to strengthen with the increase in the KiwiSaver contribution rate from April of next year. So on the one hand, New Zealanders are relieving themselves of debt. On the other, because of that, they are not spending in consumption, which is slowing our rate of growth. And I must say, sir, one of the things that did disappoint me in the budget was the deferral of the auto-enrolment exercise for KiwiSaver. I understand the reasons why, but I actually believe it's time to move to make KiwiSaver a compulsory savings scheme, and then some of the costs associated with an auto-enrolment scheme could be got over because you actually remove those incentives. Mr. Speaker, I think when one looks at the budget and the context of it and the commentators who have spoken about it and compared New Zealand's situation to the rest of the world, the one thing you can say with absolute certainty is that the claim by the Leader of the Opposition that a zero budget is a no-growth budget would be one of the greatest fallacies of all time. Because what this budget does, very cleverly in my view, is reprioritise just under $5 billion of spending into a much higher quality level of spending by seeking better performance rather than just simply throwing more money at problems. And in so doing, it lays out a couple of challenges. One, to the government sector to continually up its game in terms of the quality of service and the quality of performance for the service it delivers. And the second challenge, and the bigger challenge, is to the productive sector of this economy to now start to take those lessons on board and to make a positive contribution to New Zealand's growth moving forward. So in other words, contrary to Mr. Shearer's assertion that the only way you can get growth in the economy is for the government to grow, what this budget is saying is the government is setting its own house in order so that the circumstances are there for the productive sector of the economy to take the lead and for it to grow, for it to create the jobs, for it to create the revenue, for it to create the opportunities for the people of our country. And Mr. Speaker, again, you've got to see this in an international context. New Zealand does have an issue with debt. The OECD acknowledged that. But high debt to GDP ratios are far stronger in Europe, in Britain, even Japan, for instance, and many other countries. Higher rates than New Zealand. We are better positioned. We might not like the position we're in. We might well say we can do better, but we are better positioned than many of those countries, and many of those countries now face much harsher choices as a consequence of their position. For instance, we're not talking here, thankfully, about cuts in public service salaries, the way that the Greeks or the Irish have been speaking, or even the new socialist messiah, Monsieur Hollande, has spoken of in France. In fact, cutting senior public service salaries was one of his first acts. That is not on New Zealand's agenda, because we don't need to do that. Nor do we need to follow the rest of Europe in this headlong rush to a crazy, complicated, unworkable financial transactions tax, or even go down the path that some here advocate of a capital gains tax. Mr. Speaker, what we are doing here through this budget and through the careful and prudent reprioritisation that is occurring is setting the scene for future growth. And I think that marks a considerable difference from many of the 28 previous budgets I've seen delivered in this House. All of them have had an understandable, for different reasons at the time, preoccupation with the short term, the next electoral cycle or the next immediate crisis. This budget is brave enough to stand aside from that and say that over a long track of 4 to 5 years, very long in our parliamentary terms, the government is making some decisions about the future shape and structure of the New Zealand economy, which will in turn inform the decisions that many of the key players within that economy will make. And it's starting to send some signals which I think are long overdue and welcome. For years, successive governments, particularly actually governments of the left in New Zealand, have talked about the need for partnerships. They've called them strategic alliances or accords or those sorts of things. And in fact, what this budget does is actually start that process, because it recognises that the government can no longer do everything. What you see, the challenge used to be was people talked about partnerships, but partnerships were always led and dominated by the government. What this budget is really saying is the government cannot have all the answers, but it can know where and who the most productive or most effective groups in the economy to deliver certain needs are. So what you're starting to see in terms of the government's relationship with business, in terms of what's going on in the health and education sectors, is a much greater focus on working with the key groups to get the best outcome for the dollars that are invested. I'll give you one very specific example. I'm currently in the midst of a review of our mental health strategies. And one thing that's become very obvious during that review is that the previous pattern has been that essentially mental health issues and mental health services are government delivered. We have a vibrant NGO sector, highly skilled, highly capable, that actually wants to get involved, and there's no reason why they can't get involved in doing their job best to deliver effective services for that particular group of people. That's but one example. And what we're starting to see, sir, is the challenges that the governments of the future will face are not going to be about that traditional distribution issue, but they're going to be about the increasing demands of technology and the expectations that the public have in respect of that, and even silencing equipment mightn't be a bad advance in that respect. In other words, the point of entry that people have into the availability of public sector services, that's why things like Inland Revenue's technology system for the future is so important, and the investment in that is going to be so critical. It's why we talk about the need to protect this little ship in a very turbulent international economy. We are a country that, because of our history, relies on our ability to trade, on that big picture. But we are the one trading nation that is at the far end of the world, the developed country furthest away from any of our major trading partners. So we've got to be a global citizen. We can't pretend the world around us doesn't exist. And then, sir, finally, because it's tied up with all of this, is we've got to commit to the rebuilding of Christchurch after not one, but 4 major earthquakes in a 13-month period. I think people forget that and think that this is just some one-off event that had minimal impact. It's had a huge impact on that city and province, a significant impact on New Zealand, and because of its unusual, unique nature, it continues to have an impact today, and one simply cannot pretend that that $20 billion impact can be ignored or gone away. So what this budget is about, Mr. Speaker, is giving New Zealanders the opportunity and taking the chance to focus on our future and to build constructively for the needs we have as a country moving forward, not just dealing with today's issues, but taking a very positive long-term focus.
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, I move that this debate be now adjourned.
Question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Party votes called for. I'll ask the clerk for a party vote.
New Zealand National,
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour,
34 votes opposed.
Green Party,
14 votes opposed.
New Zealand First,
8 votes opposed.
Māori Party,
3 votes in favour.
Mana,
1 vote opposed.
ACT New Zealand,
1 vote in favour.
United Future.
1 vote in favour.
Members, the ayes are 64, the noes are 57. The motion is agreed to. Members, this debate is adjourned and set down for resumption next sitting day. The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, I move that urgency be accorded the introduction and passing of the Taxation Budget Measures Bill.